Zelensky walked into the White House, expecting a handshake, a signed minerals deal, and a suitcase full of cash for his war. Instead, he got a lecture, an awkward exit, and a one-way ticket home, empty-handed. On Friday, a dramatic confrontation unfolded at the White House, as President Donald Trump hosted Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. What was expected to be a high-level discussion quickly turned into a heated exchange, with Vice President J.D. Vance also weighing in. The message to Ukraine was clear: Washington is done playing savior. The US is shifting gears on Ukraine. Ceasefire talks between the US and Russia have begun, while Ukrainian and European officials have voiced frustration over being sidelined. As for Zelensky, publicly humiliated. In classic Trump style, he was called a dictator, with Trump even blaming him for Russia's invasion, a power move to reinforce that Ukraine needs the US more than the US needs Ukraine. Now, Europe is scrambling to reassure Zelensky after his White House embarrassment. But what does this reveal about Ukraine's position? And more importantly, who is truly responsible for the mess Ukraine is in today? Let's break it down. Zelensky's cold reality in Washington. Once hailed as a heroic leader, Zelensky is now forced to beg, plead, and put on his best Churchill impression, just to squeeze out a few more billion. Here's a hard truth: moral grandstanding and Hollywood-style war speeches don't keep the weapons flowing forever. Maybe someone should have warned him. In international politics, moral support is free. Real support, that comes with an expiration date. And now, as Washington loses interest, backing away, Europe is freaking out and divided. And Ukraine, trapped. Who could have seen this coming? Who's really to blame? After the Cold War, NATO expanded eastward, absorbing former Soviet allies. While these nations wanted security, Russia saw it as Western encroachment. NATO swears it's a defensive alliance, but to Moscow, it's a military threat creeping toward its borders. Ukraine, though not a NATO member, moved closer to Western military and political structures. Putin saw this as a red line. Why? Because Ukraine is key to Russia's strategic depth. A Western-aligned Ukraine would shatter Russia's buffer zone, threaten its access to critical ports, and weaken its influence over Eastern. In short, NATO expansion is an excuse, not the true cause. The war is about Russia's desire to dominate Ukraine, and prevent it from integrating with the West. So how the West pushed Ukraine to fight Russia, without solid guarantees? The West encouraged Ukraine to resist Russia, but never backed it up with firm commitments. They sent billions in aid and weapons, but always in ways that avoided direct escalation with Moscow. Long-range missiles, advanced fighter jets, and NATO membership were dangled like carrots, always just out of reach. Promises were made, but broken when Ukraine needed them most. The reality? Weapons came late. Tanks and F-16s arrived when the momentum was already lost. Military aid was just enough to survive, but never enough to win. Shifting Western priorities left Ukraine fighting alone, while politicians debated. Europe's fear of Russia. Despite tough rhetoric, most European countries feared direct confrontation with Russia. Energy dependence, especially Germany's reliance on Russian gas, made many hesitant to push too hard. Europe wanted to hurt Russia economically with sanctions, but relied on Ukraine to do the fighting. So what is the result? Ukraine is caught in a brutal war, encouraged by the West, while the West watches. They turned Ukraine into a battlefield for their geopolitical contest with Russia at Ukraine's expense. Now, Ukraine is being pushed toward an economic deal, not a security-focused agreement. Where Zelensky went wrong. Overestimating Western support. His biggest mistake. Zelensky believed Western leaders would back him with full military strength to the end. But they didn't, because that support was always conditional. While the US and EU provided aid, they only did so when it served their own interests. Zelensky pushed for NATO membership, but failed to secure solid security guarantees. As a result, Ukraine remains stuck in a dangerous gray zone, fighting Russia without the full protection of NATO. Rejecting early peace talks. In early 2022, Ukraine and Russia negotiated in Istanbul. Reports suggest a possible deal: Ukraine would remain neutral, in exchange for security guarantees. Zelensky, under pressure from Western leaders, especially the UK's Boris Johnson, walked away, convinced that more weapons and sanctions would cripple Russia. Result: the war dragged on. Hundreds of thousands dead. Cities in ruins. Ukraine weaker than ever. Betting everything on a failed counteroffensive. In 2023, Ukraine launched its much-hyped counteroffensive, aiming to push Russia out of occupied areas with Western-supplied weapons. The plan failed. Russia had time to dig in with deep defensive lines, including trenches, minefields, and anti-tank obstacles, making Ukrainian advances slow and costly. While the US and EU provided aid, they only did so when it served their own interests. Zelensky pushed for NATO membership, but failed to secure solid security guarantees. As a result, Ukraine remains stuck in a dangerous gray zone, fighting Russia without the full protection of NATO. Rejecting early peace talks. In early 2022, Ukraine and Russia negotiated in Istanbul. Reports suggest a possible deal: Ukraine would remain neutral, in exchange for security guarantees. Zelensky, under pressure from Western leaders, especially the UK's Boris Johnson, walked away, convinced that more weapons and sanctions would cripple Russia. Result: the war dragged on. Hundreds of thousands dead. Cities in ruins. Ukraine weaker than ever. Betting everything on a failed counteroffensive. In 2023, Ukraine launched its much-hyped counteroffensive, aiming to push Russia out of occupied areas with Western-supplied weapons. The plan failed. Russia had time to dig in with deep defensive lines, including trenches, minefields, and anti-tank obstacles, making Ukrainian advances slow and costly. Here, Ukraine lacked sufficient air support to break through Russian positions, while Russia effectively used attack helicopters and drones. By the end of 2023, the war had turned into a brutal stalemate, and Western enthusiasm for endless military aid started fading, partly due to Russia's repeated nuclear threats, and also because of growing war fatigue and political shifts in the West. Throughout the conflict, the Biden administration exercised caution in supplying advanced weaponry to Kyiv. For over a year, deliveries of long-range ATACMS missiles were blocked, with their approval contingent on assurances they wouldn't be used to strike Russian territory. Similarly, F-16 fighter jet requests were denied until July 2024, and Poland's offer to send MiG-29s was rejected, over fears of escalation. Other systems, including Patriot missiles, M1 Abrams tanks, and Grey Eagle drones, also faced delays or restrictions. Ignoring war fatigue. Zelensky kept promising total victory, retaking Crimea and all occupied territories, when the battlefield reality said otherwise. Western governments faced political pushback over endless aid. Ukraine's manpower crisis worsened. Zelensky failed to adjust his strategy, sticking to an all-or-nothing approach, instead of considering realistic compromises. Then came 2025, and everything changed. Kyiv is now gripped by nervous anticipation, not about peace, but about what Trump's presidency means for Ukraine. Trump is delivering a reality check, shifting the blame onto Zelensky. Arguing, Ukraine provoked Russia by pushing for NATO. Zelensky should have negotiated, instead of dragging the US into an unwinnable war. Billions in US aid have been wasted, and of course, it's all Biden's fault. Now, transition to the reality check on Ukraine. Trump is talking politics, but on the ground, Ukraine is struggling with war fatigue and limited options. Corruption and mismanagement, still a problem. Dependence on Western aid, A risky gamble, especially when foreign policy shifts overnight. Bottom line, his biggest mistake? Believing that Western leaders. He bet everything on Western backing, only to find it was conditional all along. As the dust settles, one truth remains: Russia played the long game, and Ukraine is running out of moves.